welcome to Imagine in America podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Jones, Associate Curator here at the National Civil Rights Museum. We have three distinguished guests today, Judy Richardson, Charlie Cobb, and Courtland Cox, all organizers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as veterans of the current SNCC Legacy Project Board members. Today, Charlie Cobb Jr. is a journalist, author, and SNCC veteran who proposed the Freedom School Project and organized for voting rights in Mississippi from 1962 to 1967. He has been a reporter for NPR, Frontline, and AllAfrica.com, and was the first Black staff writer for National Geographic. He is the co-founder of the National Association of Black Journalists and has written several books on civil rights. Judy Richardson is an author and filmmaker who from 1963 to 1966 served on the staff in SNCC's national office in Atlanta, in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, and in Lowndes County, Alabama. Her experiences gave her the perfect lens to be on a production team for the seminal PBS series Eyes on the Prize and other civil rights documentaries. She co-directed 3-week teacher institutes for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Courtland Cox served as the SNCC Executive Committee member, represented in the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom Steering Committee, and organized in Freedom Summer. He was one of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization organizers in 1965 that enabled Black residents to take control of their local government within 4 years. He served as the Secretary General of the 6th Pan-African Congress in Tanzania and worked with Trans-Africa to help end South African apartheid. Welcome to the Imagine in America podcast. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Ryan.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to start this question for everyone, and we can go down the line. Tell us how you were introduced to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and were there any initial hesitations that were made when you were committed to your activism?
Start with me?
Sure, yeah.
I was introduced to SNCC in jail. I'd been arrested in Annapolis, Maryland as a Howard University student. And the name SNCC came up because all of the people in jail with me knew about SNCC. I didn't. Then a second phase of this introduction, so to speak, was because I was involved in the sit-in movement. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, gave me a bus ticket to attend a workshop for activists in Houston, Texas, which involved traveling throughout the South. I got off the bus in Jackson, Mississippi, because the students were sitting in. And I felt it was one thing for me to be sitting in Maryland and Virginia, something qualitatively different for students in Mississippi to be sitting in, because that's where Emmett Till was killed. And as far as I was concerned, and most of my friends, Mississippi was the worst place on earth, if not the universe, for a Black person. When I told these students I was on the way to Texas, one of them, Lawrence Guyot, who would later become chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, got up from his seat and hovered over me with complete disdain. And he said, and I remember the words exactly, "You're going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights? What's the point of doing that when you're standing right here in Mississippi?" And he and others were getting ready to begin their project in the Delta. And I decided to stay with them. Better to stay with them was my reasoning than go talk about civil rights in Texas. In any case, Guyot's challenge was clear. You can go somewhere and chatter about Mississippi, or you can hang with us because we're getting ready to do stuff here. The long and short of this was I wound up staying in the state, not for the summer, but for the next 5 years, working on voter registration. And that's the brief version of my introduction to SNCC, my introduction to Mississippi, and my introduction to the work of voter registration.
Wow, thank you.
It's always interesting because I always hear new things. I mean, I've known these people for 50 years, right? And it's like every time I hear something new in the story, so it's great. Anyway, so yeah, well, I just got to back up a little bit to say that I grew up in Tarrytown, New York, which is about 35 miles north of New York City. And so when I first get introduced to SNCC, my first year at Swarthmore College, which is a Quaker college in Pennsylvania. I'm on a full scholarship. I happened to go to an SDS meeting, and SDS was the Students for a Democratic Society, the kind of northern progressive group, very supportive of the student sit-ins and of SNCC. And I just go on a lark. I go into this meeting on campus, mainly just, my mother's not there to stop me. And so I go to this meeting, I find out they're doing all these things in this SDS chapter. But one of the things they're doing is working in nearby Cambridge, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And that organization is mainly led by Gloria Richardson. And it's a very it's very grassroots organization, but she's the one who's outside. And I'm just gonna back up a little bit. So it was very much a group-centered leadership, but the one who is most out front is Gloria Richardson in Cambridge, Maryland. Well, it was affiliated, it was a SNCC affiliate. So at some point, the organizer there says, "Oh, I'm going down to the national office in Atlanta, why don't you come go with me?" I said, "Okay." I hadn't even packed anything because I'm figuring I'm coming back to Cambridge. I get down. The first thing I see is, Reggie Robinson, the local organizer in Cambridge. He goes up to this guy who's sweeping the stairs in as we come up to the national office. And I see this in the doorway, the glass doorway of the building. And I look up and I see Reggie running up to this guy, big guy, who's sweeping the stairs in overalls. And they're saying, "Hey, Captain, how you doing? What's up?" And I'm thinking, oh, this is so egalitarian, right? Because I'm assuming Reggie is hugging the janitor. I come up the stairs, and it turns out this is the larger-than-life Jim Foreman, who was the executive secretary of the organization. And then Foreman finds out that I am, and I should just mention, he did this with everybody. He's sweeping the stairs because he's telling them, okay, no job is too low for anybody to do, and every job is important to the maintenance of this organization, right? So I'm gonna sweep the stairs, and I'm gonna expect you to sweep the stairs too. So Foreman finds out that I can type, that I can take what was called shorthand, and that I could write a decent sentence. So he says, "Oh no, don't go back to Cambridge, stay here." So I stay with the national office, and what I see is this amazing energy, right? I walk in, Julian Bond, who later becomes head of the NAACP chair, he's typing with two fingers. He got the cigarette hanging out his mouth. I see a couple of receptionists, and they're calling over to the field offices and trying to find out anybody who's been killed, any churches that have been burned. They're going through that. I see the Northern Support kind of organizing Belafonte concerts in support of us. I see the research department, Jack Minnis, and he's doing research like what we prepared for Mississippi Summer. I see all these folks, and they're my age, and most of them look like me. And so I'm still assuming that first day I'm going to go back to Swarthmore College. Never made it back for 3 years. And I come into this family. And so when we talk about, we're a band of brothers and sisters in a circle of trust, that's what I come into immediately, and I don't ever want to leave it.
Well, my introduction to SNCC wasn't as exciting. I came to Howard University in January of 1960 because I was supposed to come in September 1959, but I had to work in the post office to get enough money to go to school. So I came in January 1960. And as most students, I headed for the various things, but one of my favorite places was the card room, playing pinochle, double-deck pinochle, or whist, or things like that, Dirty Hearts. And so the sit-in started on February that year. And I'm still in the card room playing cards, and kind of almost with what Charlie said, but a little in terms of the challenge, a young man named Bill Mahoney comes up to me and said, there's a demonstration at the Woolworths. Are you going to join? I said, look, I just ran this Boston here. Why are you bothering me? And he was very persistent. And after a while, I decided to go to the Woolworths and engage in that and go down, I guess at that point, later on with the trailways and so forth. So most of my early involvement was around the sit-ins and the freedom rides. But one of the things we started to do as part of the work there is we created, because SNCC was actually a student organization. It was a coordinate of campus organizations, and the one in Howard was Nonviolent Action Group. And so what we did is not only just demonstrated in terms of support of what's going on in the South, but Washington, D.C. was highly segregated. One of the big things, and people don't realize it, the route from New York to Washington was segregated. So African ambassadors and people who were representing those countries were discriminated against. So one of the things that we started engaging in is demonstrations outside of Washington. We went to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, we went to Baltimore, we rode up Route 40. And so my sense is that, my beginnings in SNCC really began with someone being persistent. When are you going to stop playing cards and come demonstrate?
Wow. Very interesting perspectives, and all of them are alike, but many different individually. Last year, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, which was a major turning point in the modern civil rights movement. Yet we're still facing voter suppression in our society today. Could each of you elaborate on why some of these attacks are still happening, and what can we do to prevent it?
You go.
Fear. White power fears the emergence of black power. They shouldn't, but they do. And what they understand is that what they're seeing with black empowerment is a reduction of their own say-so and power over the direction of the society, this country. And we see that today manifested mainly, I think, in the assault underway in public education and it's not just an assault against black history, so to speak. There's an assault underway on public education, which to me is reminiscent of what I witnessed in Mississippi all those years ago, because the assault is against education itself. They feel that the people leading this assault, such as the governor of Florida, where I live, they feel that education undermines white power. That's what they think. And that's not very, very different from the reason that states like Virginia and South Carolina during the days of slavery made teaching, education of enslaved people illegal. This is what we see today in education is a continuation. What began way back in the 18th century, when Nat Turner led his revolt in Virginia, the governor said that was because black teachers were teaching reading and writing in Sunday school, and initiated the legislation that made education of black enslaved people illegal. We're still up against this struggle in many, many ways, and we don't have nearly enough time to talk about it. But that's what I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, they've always been afraid of us. It's and certainly it goes back to when we first come over. When they first steal us from Africa. But it's now they're also worried about their own kids, the white kids, their sons, their daughters, learning about this history. Because once you learn about the history, both Charlie and I taught at Brown University, and you had kids coming in who said, I went to the best schools in the world. How come I didn't learn this stuff that we were teaching, right? And because what they're worried about is, as Charlie suggested, it's also that the racists, the white supremacists, do not want their children to know this real history. They don't want their children to know that, there's always been affirmative action, right? But it's always been affirmative action for white people. Now, once white kids know that, it absolutely undercuts the whole premise of white supremacy. Because the white supremacy premise is that white people are on top because they're better. They work harder, they're more intelligent. They can't be, white people have to be quarterbacks because they're the only ones who can think. It's all of that. Now, once you realize, well, no, the reason white people have these things and black people don't is because racism in terms of mortgages or the GI Bill in Mississippi. After the GI Bill and those black veterans come back, 100,000 of them, 100,000 white veterans got to take advantage of the GI Bill. In Mississippi, 100 black people, right? Veterans returning. And that isn't even going through all the beatings and, Medgar Evers and what happens as they try to register to vote in Mississippi, all these returning vets. So they have always been afraid of black folks. And now what you begin to see is that they're also afraid of their own children learning this history. And the problem is, poor white people, middle-class white people, a number of them go for this, to the point that there were white people in Kentucky, because somebody wrote a book about it called Dying of Whiteness. He's a doctor. And he said when he would go to these homes, they would say, if he said anything about the fact that it was Obamacare that was allowing him to visit them, they said, I don't want any of that. Now, they're willing to deny themselves health care if it's associated with somebody black. Now, that's silly, So it is also how they go against their own self-interest if they buy into that whole white supremacist argument. And part of it is because they have bought into the lie that it's a zero-sum game. That if black people share any of this power, then they have nothing. And it's so stupid, yeah.
1964 was a really important year. A number of things happened that year with Freedom Summer. The first is one of the things that was so devastating is that, Senator Stennis and the other people
Eastland
from Mississippi came up and said black people were happy. They didn't want to vote. They just, if you give them some watermelon, some fried chicken, good. However, what happened was that they were kind of what Richard Wright talked about, is they were invisible. They were invisible in America. They were invisible. They were visible to themselves, but they were visible to the power structure of America. What happened with Freedom Summer created visibility. And what was important in terms of that visibility, it was people say that the people in Mississippi and so forth were brave. That's not the most important thing. What they were determined. And the determination on a day by day basis to break the bounds of segregation and so forth was the critical piece. So, and then not only that determination and the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964 and the challenge in Atlantic City really realigned the Democratic Party, but also realigned politics in the United States. So if you really want to understand what you see today in the various political arenas, you go back to 1964. And so that the Mississippi was very important in terms of people exercising power through their determination and the realignment of politics in the United States.
Absolutely.
Can I just to piggyback on that, because what we did also affected the rest of the country, right? So when he mentioned Senator Stennis and Senator Eastland, the two white supremacist senators from Mississippi at that time, had enormous power because at that time seniority really did matter. And so they're over the Senate Appropriations Committee, over the Armed Services Committee, committees that had real money. So what we're saying to the rest of the country is, the reason they have seniority is because black people have been killed and beaten for trying to get the vote. the main thing we're trying to do with Freedom Summer is how do you get black people registered to vote without getting them killed, right? But it will affect the rest of the country because these two senators, as they were throughout the DSouth, they are making decisions that are against what you are doing in California. You white people in New York or Wisconsin or California. If we can get rid of people like these, it will help you as well, right? And so it involved a lot of education for the rest of the country as well.
Right.
And if I can add a coda to that, I mean, what white supremacists, particularly the politicians, felt and feared was that democracy undermines whites' power. Mm-hmm. That's what was at bottom there. Right. Democracy, real democracy would have, of course, embraced white people. And I'll spell you all the stories that I know about white people in Mississippi. Democracy undermines white power, and that issue is still with us today.
I'm sorry. The other point, see what happens is if I don't write it down, then I forget. I knew there were 2 points, and I got to the first one. The other thing that we did was that we democratized the Democratic Party too. Now, not that, democracy, we're putting all this in quotes, but still, up until the time that we went to Atlantic City, it was an old boys network. What they agreed to, the Democratic National Committee, was that what they would give us, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, was that starting in 1972, was it, with the Church Committee? I think it was 72, and maybe in 68. Did it start in 68? In 1968, the Democratic Party, those delegations had to represent ethnically the ethnic population in their districts. So you couldn't have all white people coming, or even from Jersey, you couldn't have them coming, because it was now in the rules because of what they had allowed, what they had finally granted to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They changed their rules. So when you look at the conference, the Democratic conferences, it looks so different from the Republicans, which is very, very white, right? And what you look at is now Latinos and Asian Americans and Native Americans and black people. But that comes because of the agreement that they gave to us after that 64 Freedom Summer.
And those were codified as the McGovern rules.
That's it.
Yeah.
That changed the face
Sure.
of the political infrastructure of the United States.
And you were speaking about James Eastland and Stennis and how they approached Freedom Summer as an invasion. Mm-hmm. And to the point where 3 civil rights workers disappear Father's Day 1964, and just weeks, the bodies aren't even found. They're calling this a hoax. So spreading that type of disinformation to not take the accountability of all of the attempts to provide safety for folks that are traveling into the state just to help exercise a constitutional right under the 15th and 19th Amendment. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. Court, Mr. Cox, you began in this struggle at the age of 19 on the steps at the Lincoln Memorial March on Washington, August 1963. Tell us about the long struggle you realized was embedded in the American Civil Rights Movement and how each generation of activists could view this as a layered strategy towards justice and equity.
Actually, I was 22, but
okay.
I was a little older.
Okay.
But here's the deal, and I want to use this little example, and we were 22, and we were full of, we're bad, and you have to have that attitude, being able to, on a daily basis, be able to function in a situation that Charlie and Judy talk about in terms of fear. You had to have a sense of self. So John Lewis had a speech, which was very important, because one of the lines in that speech, and one of the first times it's been made politically in this country, was one person, one vote. It's the African cry, it must be ours.
It is our cry too.
And so my sense is that, so what happened is that there was a whole discussion about what the purpose of the March on Washington was. for most people, and some people, I'm not going to call any names, it was to support legislation. For a group of other people, it was to expand our reach and democracy. And one of the big issues, and you have to look at it that way, because one of the things at 22, I was in a room with A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, Roy Wilkins, Bayard Rustin and everybody. But I thought I was an equal too, And what happened in terms of that argument back and forth, what was the purpose of the March on Washington? First, the Kennedy administration was very afraid of the March on Washington. But when they felt comfortable with it, Kennedy wanted to address the March on Washington. He wanted to speak. And Bayard Rustin said, to him, this is a disaster. And if he speaks, it becomes his march. We have to have it to be our march. And thanks to the quick-wittedness of Bayard Rustin, Bayard made up a story which said that he heard that if the president came, the black community would stone him. Bayard made that up coming back from the bathroom, but it was sufficient enough to scare Kennedy. But the big issue in terms of us, in terms of the long struggle, was that the Kennedy administration didn't like John's speech because it criticized the administration. It had the focus not of supporting his legislation, but advancing our cause. And they sent a mission, Archbishop of Boyle, to say that the Catholics would pull out, because the March on Washington was a coalition of Jews, Catholics, civil rights groups, laborers, that the Catholics would pull out if John didn't change his speech. And we said, okay, bye. And then Bayard Rustin came to us and said, well, that's not the great idea. And we said, yeah, we think it's a great idea. And Bayard, again, being very smart, brought A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph explained to us that he first tried to have the March on Washington in 1941, the year I was born. And this is 20 years later, and I'm looking at this man, and he had been engaged in the struggle, not only since 41, before that. And, at 22 years, I'm thinking, well, if I kick a hole in the sky, this will be over at least 6 months, no more than a year. And you began to realize how long, talking to Bayard and talking to Randolph and talking to the people that you actually saw, you could see how deep this discussion was. So at that point, I began to realize that even at 22, I was not going to kick a hole in the sky. I had to be engaged over time. And here I am, 64 years later, engaged in the discussion.
It's really powerful.
Could I just piggyback on that? Because he mentioned the speech that was the SNCC speech that, that John delivers. And in that beginning, there were a couple of things that get excised from it. But what doesn't get excised, and I know we're doing this for the Memphis Civil Rights Museum, so, and certainly Dr. King talks about it, what we need is a radical redistribution of economic power, right? Well, in the SNCC speech, John talks about that at the very beginning, right? And he says, we're sorry that more of our brothers, and he would later add sister, I guess, but no, more of our brothers cannot make it because they are making $2 a day in the home of a white person making $70,000 a year. Right. We're talking about economic inequality in 1963 in SNCC, and at that point we're 19, 20, 21 years old, right? So that was a constant within SNCC. We're always kind of at the vanguard of a number of things, even as the only youth-led organization in the civil rights movement.
And that I want to stay with you, Judy, on that as a youth organization, but also as a woman. As a black woman, and when I think of SNCC, I think of one of the brainchilds of the modern civil rights movement, Mrs. Ella Baker.
Hello.
And so, as a black woman in this movement, what challenges did you experience within SNCC's ranks and in the struggles generally, and what is different today?
Well, I think I felt probably my strongest as a woman when I was in SNCC. And I'm feeling that when I come in. I'm at that point 19 years old, right? And you will find that is true. Most of certainly the black women and a number of the white women who were in the early stages of SNCC, that they all felt that same way, that we were surrounded by other women who were considered leaders, acknowledged as leaders within SNCC. Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, right? She had come off the Freedom Rides. She was a Spelman student. She does 30 days jail, no bail in Rock Hill, South Carolina. She was fierce, right? And Courtland can talk about her some more too, because people talking about her as the general, right? People might have worried about Foreman, but they were scared of Ruby Doris. And she had done, when she was on the Freedom Ride, went into the dreaded Parchman Prison, right? Diane Nash, when she comes in as the leader of the Nashville movement, what I found when I come into SNCC is that it's not just the women whom I see as leaders and who assume that there are things I could do that I didn't even know I could do. I would not have trusted me knowing what I did not know to do what they assumed I could do, right? And however, it's also the guys, because the guys are used to female leadership in SNCC. It is not what's happening in SCLC, which is primarily black Baptist ministers who are used to hierarchy. It's not the kind of, upper middle class black thing that you get at the national office of the NAACP, where they don't want to talk about grassroots leadership. We're working with local NAACP in like Amsley Moore, Medgar Evers, they're all local, right? They welcome the youth energy and stuff. But at the national level, that's not what they want. They're tired of hearing about grassroots leadership and stuff. But when I come in, I am surrounded by people who assume that I can do more than I ever thought I could do. And so I take that with me through all the other stuff, the 14 hours eyes on the prize. How did I think I could even do film? I had no idea how to do film when I first started on that first hour of the 14. Had no idea. Because I'm coming with all the confidence these guys gave me, and the women, and looking at Ruby Doris, and Muriel Tillinghast, and of course Miss Baker. But there are all these female leaders in SNCC, right? So in terms of what it's like now, when you look at the youth leadership, a lot of that is women, BYP 100, Dream Defender, you had a lot of female, and of course the Me Too movement was women as well. But even in some of the Latino movements, whatever, you see female leadership. And so even now, and I see it actually in some ways more now in terms of the groups, of the young groups, than I probably would have seen generally among the more traditional organizations back then in the civil rights movement.
Interesting, really. Mr. Cobb, as a journalist and as a writer, you've seen positive and negative effects of media, how media can have on activists. What advice would you give today to activists today about how to engage the media?
Go for it.
That's a hard question. There's several things. One, I encourage young activists to talk to media with a certain understanding that the media is not going to be in the same place they're going to be. And they have to understand that going into conversation with media. And that there's very little that they can do about it. I say of media all the time, and this is a problem back in our day in the 60s and is a problem now, that what this best describes media is that what they say is best defined by what they don't say. It's what's left out that describes the bias. It's not, you can spot bias and prejudice in a story that you read in a newspaper or hear on television. What you can't talk about is what's left out, especially if you don't know what's left out. And that's what media does all the time. I'm witnessing it today in the current political climate, for instance. And I try, in talking to young activists, get that across. If we had a lot of time, I could give you lots and lots of examples, or I could give you a long, long paper that I wrote about this, going all the way back to the 50s. For all of that, I think activists have to engage media. They just have to figure out how they want to engage media. It's useless to say media is biased and prejudiced. Yes, it is. And you can make some choices on that basis. There are members of media that I wouldn't talk to, knowing who they are. But there are a lot of media is ignorant, and how you get from what you get from educating them is going to be limited. Just is, because of the culture that we live in. But you'd be surprised, and again, we don't have time to go into the people who have heroically made the way for people like me behind them, a generation or two behind them, in media. But I think you have to engage.
Yeah.
If you don't engage, you get nothing.
Sure. I'm going to follow up with two questions here, and we can conclude. You all worked in some of the most dangerous regions on the planet during this time. We're talking about how there's the United States, there's the South, and there's Mississippi. And then if you go east into the state of Alabama, U.S. Highway 80, that black belt, Lowndes County specifically, known as Bloody Lowndes. The names of the martyrs are endless almost. As activists during that time, and I think Diane Nash said it really well, we can't let violence keep us from our eyes on the prize, right? We can't let this resistance put this fear in us so that we can't demand these equal rights. Was there a time in the movement in that era or those regions where you felt the most frightened, if you feel comfortable sharing?
I think that's not a correct way to characterize danger, violence, or fear. Of course, going all the way back to the days of slavery, there's been fear. What's remarkable is the people, the deep, deep wells of strength that enable black people to resist that or to move forward despite the fear. Fear is obvious, and there's reason for it. We were talking about education earlier, and as we were talking, I didn't mention them, and you will know them, Harry T. and Harriet Moore,
yes,
who were teachers in Florida. Mrs. Moore, in a very violent part of Florida, on the first day of school, collected the history books from her students and stacked them in the corner. And she had her own literature for teaching history. Harry Moore was an NAACP leader. And both of them were killed when the Ku Klux Klan put dynamite under their bedroom on Christmas Eve.
1951.
And
55.
Yeah.
Was it 51?
51.
51. You got it.
was
You're right. 51.
and-
That's what you were
and
saying.
blew
Okay.
them up. And it's obvious the fear that unfolds because of something like that. And there are lots of examples from Lowndes County to Sunflower County, Mississippi, of this kind of thing. What's remarkable is that you could always find people, strong people, who were willing to take on this system and manage to survive in taking on this system. This is Fannie Lou Hamer's story, for instance, or this is any number of people, but Mrs. Hamer would be an obvious person here. I think the idea of fear is overplayed. I think the idea of strength is underplayed. And part of what we're trying to do in the SNCC Legacy Project is put forward the idea of strength in the black community. That's what's got us through the days of slavery. That's what got us through the destruction of the Reconstruction era effort after the Civil War. That's what got us through the resumption, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the early part of the 20th century. And that's what got us through people like Stennis and Eastland and the White Citizens Council, which was nothing more than a Rotary Club wearing a white supremacist business face. That's what's got us through all of this, and that's underplayed. And I try and talk about it a lot, and so does the SNCC Legacy Project.
And also the part which you were referring to was that we always understood, and we're getting this from the local leaders who are guiding and guarding us, is that you cannot let violence stop the movement, that no matter what happens, and you get that in the sit-ins as well, right? So when you were referring to Diane Nash, one of the things they talked about was there would be a first wave of students, they'd be sitting on the stools, they would get brutalized, they would get arrested, the next wave comes. That you never let violence stop the movement, and that's key. And and I should one other thing. And if you were next to somebody who was not afraid, you stayed away from them because that person would get you killed. There has to be some sense that you are part of this reality. You should be scared. It's what you do after that. You don't get immobilized, you keep going, because around you are the people who are local people who've been here forever. They know even better than you do what they can expect, and they still move forward. So, yeah, okay.
So Bernice Regan has a song that she did in tribute to Miss Baker, and there's a line in there that goes, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." And what I think the point that Charlie made in terms of strength was a belief system that said, even if I don't get it, I want the next generations. I mean, it seems to me, people like E.D. Nixon, in terms of what we couldn't get the vote, but kept going in terms of getting the vote. Emmett Till's mother, so I want these people to see what has happened. It is, I can take this horror, but we're gonna fight this. The maids in 1955 who decided they would rather walk than sing. So the people in 1957 who decided in Little Rock they would send their kids to the school to break this up. So the sense of a belief. I mean, and we mentioned Ruby Doris and Diane Nash and Annie Pearl Avery. There is a big sense of we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
Judy,
Yo.
we're talking about film. You've spent a large time with your activism, educating others about the civil rights movement and documenting it through film. What strategies deployed in the 1960s movement do you think we should engage in combating racism today?
Well, I think the importance of images can't be overplayed. People who are on Twitter now X, understand that, but it's in a kind of minimal way, and you can't depend on that. But it is one way to get the images you want out there and to use them and frame them the way you want. It was important for me that when I worked on the 14 Hours of Eyes on the Prize, that we were reframing, for the first time, we were reframing the civil rights movement. When I first get there, I am the first full-time employee, right? And I'm looking at Stride Toward Freedom, which is Dr. King's, the account of Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott. It's 1 hour. And everything is about Dr. King, who was amazing. I mean, so that's not even the question, but who was amazing. But the camera follows him to Birmingham. You don't hear about Shuttlesworth, just hear about Dr. King. Everywhere he goes, he goes to Selma. You don't hear about Mrs. Boynton or Mr. Boynton, you hear about Dr. King. Eyes on the Prize, when it first comes out in '86, is the first time you hear about regular people who are the leaders who sustain that movement. And so that's where you first get Mrs. Hamer and Mrs. Devine from the 4th Congressional District and Mrs. Gray from the 5th, Hattiesburg. You see the women, the female leadership, but you also see just these regular folks who are talking about, we had Guyot on, and in that, you see folks who look like you and your neighbors and your cousins and your nephews and your mothers and your clergy, because if people don't see people who look like them, then they don't know they can do it themselves. And then all those horrible other people, the white supremacists, then they win. So what we did in Eyes, and that power of the image of seeing yourself as leaders who made and sustained the movement, that was key. And I think young people understand that as well. They show themselves.
Eyes on the Prize was so impressionable, because I remember being 12, 13 years old and watching that first episode, Awakenings.
Yes.
That's what it was called. And I remember my dad had the VHS copies for so long, and at that moment I knew that something about that story had to have been continued. So thank you for your work on that. Final question before we wrap up here. We're in a system now where people are talking about banning these books. We're talking about children and this legacy continuing to passing the torch. What is the response to this pushback of banning books that talk about these things that happened in American history? And these things didn't happen in ancient times. They happened in my parents' lifetime, and so how do we push back? How do we stop the pushback on banning books and to convey that this is a story that should be taught to all children and Americans?
Well, that's an organizing mission. We have to get rid of these politicians who do that. And we have the capacity to do that. Question is, can we organize that? A lot of times, these school boards and the like, and these state legislatures and the like, and yes, these governors and the like, they do that because we have not been organizing and fighting effectively to put it simply, get rid of them.
I think there are a couple of things. First, as Charlie said, we have to engage politically. But you're now giving me a chance to talk about the SNCC Legacy Project. Because basically we understand that, as Judy was talking about, and Charlie was talking about, who's in the story is particularly important. And we have created a whole digital platform that begins to tell the story from the bottom up, and for the people who were engaged, and from the inside out. So you not only get a sense of what happened or what action was taken, but what were they trying to do? What was the thinking? What was the discussion? Back and forth. I mean, we have the watch reports that are there. We have photographs. We have the executive, Judy with her short hair taking down the
minutes.
the SNCC executive committee minutes. So basically, we have to fight on two fronts, and we have done that over a period of time. So the first is, as was said, politically. But coming out in 1966, 67, 68, we knew we had to do it. So we opened up Drum and Spear Bookstore and Drum and Spear Press. We also knew we had to do it in terms of other things. We had the Center for Black Education and other educational institutions. We now know it. We have to function in the digital world, from TikTok to Instagram to college courses. So we are developing all of that, and our purpose at this point is to educate people, not only in terms of the history, but also the need to continue the struggle. Because as we said, if we believe in freedom, we cannot rest.
And I would also say, because Courtland referred to the website, certainly SNCC Legacy Project has its website, but the documentary website is sncdigital.org, so snccdigital.org, and it is all things SNCC. It is who we were, what we did, and why we did it. And it's also our intergenerational conversations. But it's all very very searchable. But by the way, I am wearing a button that says Teach Banned Books. And what's interesting about the banning, it's not just the Mothers for Liberty and the craziness that they're doing. What you're beginning to see is pushback, not just from black folks and black teachers, but you're also seeing it from white parents who say, you don't get to take these books off the shelves, right? So they're getting also more involved. There's a wonderful group based out of Ohio called Red Wine and Blue, grassroots organized suburban, primarily white women who have these wonderful Zoom calls, right? And their thing is, and as a result, they started with the banned books. They now have young people with, what are the banned books? We will start reading them in a group. They now have, Heather Cox Richardson just recently did their piece. But the other thing they're doing is starting to say, okay, we're going to deal with choice too. So it's the entryway for a lot of folks to get into some of the other things. They are really taught. That's why Ohio is starting to turn. And also you have things like Teaching for Change and the Zen Education Project, folks who really are understanding what the importance is of teaching, of pushing back on these bans.
Wow. Thank you, the three of you, for participating in this. This is extremely enriching and educational, and thank you for all of your courage and sacrifice throughout the years.
And no sacrifice. I enjoyed my time.
Thank you all again. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Imagine in America podcast. We encourage you to subscribe to the museum's Imagine in America podcast series wherever you listen to podcasts. Send us your comments and share these episodes on social media. For more information, visit us at imagineinaamerica.org.
Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.